Please, can I request you to mute yourselves? Great. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining the November session of our Conversations on Social Reproduction. I'm absolutely delighted to host Professor Rhacel Parreñas today. Professor Parreñas is the Eberlein Professor of Sociology at the University of Southern California. She's a prolific scholar, and she has chronicled the everyday life of globalization for several years with a focus on women's labor markets. She has written about labor and migration from the Philippines, and her several books include Servants of Globalization, Migration and Domestic Work, Illicit Flirtations, Labor, Migration and Sex Trafficking in Tokyo, and Children of Global Migration, Transnational Families and Gendered Woes. She's also the co-editor of the Stanford University Press book series on globalization in everyday life. We are here today to celebrate the launch of her most recent book, which is titled Unfree, Migrant Domestic Work in Arab States, published by Stanford University Press. It is an absolutely brilliant book, which at once pushes forward theoretical, empirical, and methodological boundaries, but is also provocative in many ways, and it's definitely worth a read. And I'm so pleased that she has agreed to share her work with us today. I'm also happy to introduce our commentators, Praveena Koduth and Vani Saraswati. Praveena Koduth is professor at the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, and she's conducted extensive research on Indian women's overseas migration, as well as the labor market prospects of women workers in destination countries. She's currently involved in 2 studies on migration, one on child migrants' access to public provisions, and the second is a study of the effect of COVID on overseas employment from a Kerala village. We also have with us Vani Saraswati, who is the editor-at-large and director of projects migrantrights.org and the author of Stories of Origin, The Invisible Lives of Migrants in the Gulf. So Vani moved to Qatar in 1999, and she spent 17 years there, during which time she launched some of Qatar's leading periodicals. So a very warm welcome to all our speakers, as well as all of you attendees. So the format for this session is fairly informal. We will have presentations from Rhacel and from Praveena and Vani. And we'll offer Rhacel a brief opportunity to respond to the comments, and then we will open up for Q&A. So this session will be recorded, and we will try and wrap up within an hour and 15 minutes or so, given the late hour in India. So now over to Rhacel.
So let me start by thanking Prava for hosting this event, and to the commentators for participating. And I'm very mindful that it's really late in India right now, so I really appreciate your presence here. And thank you to the audience for coming to hear more about this recent work of mine. So this book, Unfree, is on the labor conditions of migrant domestic workers, particularly from the Philippines. And my investigation into their labor conditions is really to engage their categorization as trafficked persons, and how, you know, their experiences then can challenge the way we understand their subjugation and the subjugation of migrant workers who find themselves in positions of being bound to their employer, and being in a position of not being able to quit their job freely. And so in, as many I think of you know, in the context of the Gulf, the system that controls migrant workers is the kafala system. And under the kafala system, migrant workers, migrant domestic workers, cannot, they're first bound to their employer. They must solely work for that employer. And secondly, they cannot quit without their employer's permission. And so while many Gulf countries have revisited this legal status and have absolved this for many workers, they have exempted migrant domestic workers from reform, from the recent reform. And so till this day, migrant domestic workers across this region are still bound to their employers. So I do want to say that this status is not exclusive or particular to that region of the world, but it is actually one that we could say migrant domestic workers globally, share. And so this is so domestic workers in Israel, domestic workers in Singapore, domestic workers in England, they all sort of share a similar situation. We could also say that this is the case for the United States with those coming in with their expat employers or as domestic workers of diplomats. And so many scholars, many of my colleagues have written about this, and many have sort of made this conclusion that, or asserted this conclusion that the solution to domestic work problems is really the reform of the kafala, and abolishing the kafala would then, sort of universally improve their labor conditions. And that's sort of a unilateral argument that's made and advanced by not just scholars, but also migrant advocates. And so that's what I was sort of coming in with when I started the study. Before I begin more in terms of, before I begin further talking about my findings, I do want to say something about my methods. When I talk about this project, everyone assumes that I did convenient sampling, and that would be like just going there and finding sort of who is easiest to kind of identify. And so people assume then that I wouldn't really get to the worst of their experiences because I wouldn't have access to these domestic workers without a day off who are imprisoned by their employers, et cetera, et cetera. But when we think about it, actually, if I did convenient sampling, I would actually end up with a worst picture of domestic work conditions there, because then I would end up just going to a shelter run by, a sending state government like the Philippines, where when I was doing field work in any given day, there would be like 100 migrant domestic workers, sort of who had escaped their employers, who experienced the worst we could possibly imagine of labor conditions there. So instead of convenient sampling, what I tried to do was try to really diversify my sample, really set a quota of making sure that my sample included those with a day off, but also those without a day off, those who've worked, for many years in the country, those who had not worked for many years, those who were undocumented versus documented. And finally, I made sure that my sample included workers who worked for a diversity of employers that included Emirati, other Arabs, Westerners, Iranians, South Asians. And so then I managed that feed. So I talk about this extensively in the book, in my appendix on methodology. And so in addition to my interviews with domestic workers, I also made sure that I represented the perspectives of other stakeholders. And so that would be sending state governments. It would also be like employers, rights advocates, recruitment agencies. I did try to speak to government representatives, and that was really more of a challenge. I did get to speak to one high-ranked government official in the Ministry of Labor, but we did that interview off the record. And so what did I find? So as an ethnographer, I like for my subjects to often speak about their own experiences instead of me sort of just telling you what their experiences were. And so one of my main findings, empirical findings in the study, is that sort of contrary to my colleagues who basically say that there's sort of this universal experience of extreme subjugation that domestic workers would experience under the kafala, what I found was instead a more diverse range of experiences among domestic workers. And so there's domestic workers with a day off, without a day off. There's domestic workers who, are allowed to work for other households. Most are not. There's domestic workers with access to communications, those with not. Domestic workers who sleep in their own private bedroom, even with air conditioning, with access to the Filipino channel. And you have domestic workers who are, forced to sleep in the hallway, domestic workers who are, made to sleep with the elderly person they're taking care of or the children they're taking care of. So I really saw a diversity of labor conditions, and that was like one of the challenges for me as a sociologist, which is how do I explain the diversity that arises out of this very extreme subjugated position of being bound to someone under the kafala system. And so as a sociologist, we also have to come up with a more systematic and schematic way of explaining our findings. And so what I found was that there's really 3 household cultures in the United Arab Emirates. And so there are households that dehumanize their domestic workers. And then there's households that infantilize their domestic workers. And so by infantilize, we're talking about, employers who treat their domestic workers as childlike, who don't really see them as adults, so they micromanage how they do their work. They micromanage their lives. The worst form of infantilization, we could say, is when employers hold on to the wages of domestic workers because they're doing it, quote unquote, for their own good. Like an employer told me, my domestic worker is illiterate and their family, in Sri Lanka abuses them. And so I hold on to their salary to make sure that it's managed properly. And then you also have domestic workers who are recognized and respected as people, seen as adults with their own kinds of desires and preferences. And so one of the ways that I compare domestic workers and measure their different labor conditions is by looking at their food consumption. So there's many ways we could measure domestic work. We could look at work conditions, work responsibilities, like access to communication, salary, and then, so one of the ways we can also look at work conditions by looking at like food consumption. And so describing my findings through food consumption, I'll give you 3 examples then. So I had domestic workers who did experience, the worst in terms of food. And so some of my interviewees were only fed once a day. Some were only given leftovers. And so you see the dehumanization of domestic workers through food consumption in a variety of ways, being made to eat only after employers is one, sort of not so extreme, being banned from eating certain foods, being given access to certain foods in the house is another way. But, the more extreme one is starving the domestic workers. And so one domestic worker who I interviewed, who I called Annalisa, she experienced that sort of subhuman treatment by her employers. And as she told me, and I'm going to quote her right now, and she said, I told her, madam, if you don't want to give me food, just send me back to the agency. My agency told me I have free food. She called the agency and said, your housemaid is asking for viand, which is sort of this antiquated way of saying kind of meat with starch. She was told then give her even just like instant noodles, egg or tuna, but said she doesn't want to. No, because when her children eat and I ask for food, she gets mad. She says the food budget is for the children, and that does not include me, that I can only rice. Exactly what I did is I would just ask for coffee and put it in my rice. She said that is the only way of eating in the Philippines, put coffee on rice. And so Annalisa is one of the domestic workers who I met who experienced dehumanization without question. She was inadequately fed, negotiating with her employer, didn't really materialize to anything positive. And so she was forced to run away. And so the labor attaché from the Philippine consulate told me that he estimates about 4% of domestic workers will experience this extreme kind of brutal dehumanization. And my findings support his claim in that the majority of domestic workers I met did not experience dehumanization. They were actually more likely to be recognized or infantilized. And so infantilized domestic workers are those who are fed 3 times a day. They're given adequate food, but their food intake is really controlled by their employers, or their food intake is, does not take into account their own preferences, their own desires, their own taste. And so oftentimes, they oftentimes don't necessarily like the food of their employers. One example I have is that there was a domestic worker who was working for a fitness trainer. And so this fitness trainer was always on a diet. So there was no rice in their house. They had quinoa and all these other healthy foods. And they expected their domestic worker to eat these healthy foods. And so the domestic worker was kind of unhappy with that situation. But, we also have situations where the domestic workers, found their food really kind of not palatable. And so one such domestic worker is one I named Juna. And she had an employer who only ate quote unquote spicy vegetarian Indian food. And so Juna complained. She says, the problem is food. They're vegetarian. I'm banned from eating our food. Meat I cannot eat because it stinks. Fish, chicken, all egg is the only thing available. I can't even eat canned food. One time my neighbor smuggled in some meat to me. She wrapped it really well, but she, the employer, still smelled it. And she screams, what is that smell, Juna? And so Juna basically then continues that, she says, sometimes I eat even if I do not like what I have available to eat. Everything is spicy. I'd complain, Madam, it's too spicy. She said, oh, Juna, just have rice and coffee. So rice and coffee is what I have. I would eat instead of something that I cannot stomach. So we see with Juna, she's also kind of, her experience borders dehumanization as her infantilization of not being sort of given consideration for the food she likes. Sometimes leads to her like not eating much at all. But many of the domestic workers I met were fed adequately. And my examples with this woman, Dora Lynn, who had, an ideal employer who was very conscious of her food preferences as a Filipino. And so Dora Lynn shared, quote, she treats me like a family. They give you our foods that you should be eating. In the Philippines, isn't it true that we eat rice 3 times a day? In contrast, my employers only eat bread. Then they have just tea. My employer told me, Dora, everything and anything you want, please just make a list. So I told her pork, rice. I listed everything. I wrote down Licas papaya. She said, oh, Dora, what is that? Licas papaya. It is the type of soap in the Philippines. So I told her, sorry, madam, do not bother buying that. I will buy it myself. I will ask the Filipinos who are working in the mall on where I could get it. But she managed to find it. And so then I have 6 minutes left here. And so I do want to sort of make these clarifications. So you have these 3 types of households, and I find that consistent throughout, like regardless of what work conditions I'm measuring. Who is likely to do what, right? And so there is this sort of internal Orientalism in the country going on, where a lot of Western employers say, whatever I'm doing, I'm like, it's better than any of the locals, because the locals are the worst employers, like Emiratis, Arabs, even South Asians, the worst. But I found that these claims, of sort of Orientalism, it's not necessarily accurate. I find that Western employers, they might give them a day off more than locals because of their sort of notions of gender is a little bit more liberal than locals. But in terms of work conditions, they're not necessarily going to fare better. Domestic workers are not necessarily going to fare better. I have one employer that I interviewed who basically brazenly told me that she encourages her domestic worker to work for other households when she's not working, but it is under the condition that she will take 50% of the salary that the domestic worker makes. And then likewise, I interviewed a South Asian who only eats spicy vegetarian food, who told me that she's very conscious that her food is not palatable to her domestic worker. So she lets her domestic worker not only cook what she wants, but she makes sure that the supplies of foods that is preferred by the domestic worker, she supplies to the domestic worker. So I'm really pushing against these sort of stereotypes of employers that circulate even among employers. It's one of the things that I do in this book. And so lastly, then it's like, so I'm trying to figure out then, how do I explain this wide range of labor standards across households in the UAE? How does this then, challenge the way we think about human trafficking or the way we think about freedom in general? And so much of the book is spent on theorizing freedom in a way that can account for the extreme subjugation that domestic workers are subject to without disregarding the fact that not all domestic workers are subject to like extreme violence under these extreme conditions of the lack of, labor market mobility. And so I don't want to get into this so much, but I was really pushed towards advocating for more Republican and less of a liberal sense of freedom. And a Republican notion of freedom looks at freedom not as sort of being constrained or being free of constraints, but a Republican notion of freedom looks at freedom as being, susceptible to abuse. And so if you look at someone being unfree as being susceptible to abuse, then you also recognize the fact that not everyone in a position of power acts on that susceptibility. And then the goal then for advocates is to decrease that susceptibility. And so how do you work within the existing system, which is realistically what many have to do, and how then do you push for decreasing the desire or the want or even the feeling that employers might have that they could do something to subjugate their domestic workers. And so much of the book talks about how morals, morally pressuring employers to really look at sort of the work from the domestic worker's perspective is something I advocate for in my discussion of unfreedom for domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates. So let me just end there, and I welcome any comments you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rhacel, for a very succinct summary of, a book that's quite wide-ranging. And, I'm sure we'll have a chance to ask you more questions. So now I'll hand over to Praveena for her comments.
Thank you, Rhacel, for a really, really fascinating book that I read with great interest. I mean, for me, it was also a way of getting a comparative perspective. My own fieldwork has been almost entirely in the source regions of migration in India. And India is a remarkably different case of the migration of domestic workers when you compare it to the Philippines. So in a sense, that's where I'm coming from. Your work was not just empirically rich and one that advances a new explanatory framework, but also I found your methodology so innovative in the way that you went about walking with these women when they went along on their walks, so that you could actually get access to women who did not have a day off. I mean, this really takes a lot of creative thinking, to get together a diverse set of respondents. So I get what you mean when you say that this is not a convenient sample. It's really a sample that tries to get in as large a diverse section of respondents as possible. So you characterize domestic workers as being unfree, wherein you emphasize their vulnerability to abuse rather than abuse itself, and to make this distinction between employers who do abuse and others who do not. But the vulnerability arises from the arbitrary authority of employers under the kafala, and not all employers choose to exercise that authority. So that's basically the argument that you're making in the book. I have a couple of clarificatory questions on the Republican notion of freedom, and they're coming from my own unfamiliarity with the terrain. You see this notion of freedom as non-domination and as being appropriate for the analysis of the condition of domestic workers under kafala, because of the way it places societal membership over individualism. I got this feeling that in doing so, the analysis steered away from a rights discourse, and I am mindful that there are problems with the existing application of a rights discourse, particularly when the conditions of domestic work in the Middle East is characterized in singular and overarching terms as modern slavery, trafficking, or forced labor. So my questions then are really about the idea of social membership within this notion of freedom and how it may pertain to the position of migrant workers under the kafala, because they are migrant workers. And then, the whole notion of societal membership, how does it include them? So how does societal membership get operationalized for migrant workers, and especially vulnerable migrant workers like domestic workers, as it seems to rest on a notion of community? This is my understanding, whether national, religious, or ethnic. So what does the everyday reality of domestic workers in the UAE tell us about their societal membership? Would it be correct to say that kafala leads to a segmented and stratified society? You refer to complex societies that then allows migrant workers to achieve a notion of belonging informally in the absence of citizenship, as it is mostly among themselves. That is, the community is mostly among themselves. And as the adoption of a Republican notion of freedom seems to steer away from an analysis using the language of labor rights, how does it impinge on the idea of migrant domestic workers as laboring women with rights? Now, the focus of the book is on the processes that make migrant workers unfree. In your own words, how migrant workers are constituted accordingly experience labor migration as unfree persons. This makes for a fascinating journey that documents how domestic workers first encounter the kafala while still in the Philippines through the mandatory training and orientation process that contributes to forging unfree subjectivities. It was really fascinating to read about how domestic workers learn that they have rights through the training process, but also that they cannot really expect to exercise those rights. And the way to reconcile the contradiction is by mobilizing morality in their everyday negotiations with employers. Now, as the recruitment and migration processes vary widely across source countries, from a comparative perspective, how domestic workers are constituted too may vary and be differently nuanced depending on the source country. So differences in the making of unfree persons through processes at the source of migration are likely to have implications for how migrant domestic workers negotiate their employers or negotiate with the system at the destination. India adopts a paternalist migration policy towards domestic workers. It lacks an adequate migration and infrastructure, which means scant opportunities for formal training and orientation, and migrants depend heavily on informal resources and actors. Therefore, the orientation of Indian domestic workers would be quite significantly different. Now, you cite Andrew Gardner's argument that Indian workers keep migrating to the Middle East because they're not aware of the risks, as previous migrants choose to hide their experiences from intending migrants, and point out that this is not true of Filipino workers. I just want to add a corrective. Indian workers do learn of the risks of abuse, but not in a systematic way in which the migrants from Philippines learn about it. But contrary to Gardner's argument, stories of abuse had wide circulation in the source regions in India, but so do stories of success. And workers also go repeatedly despite previous experiences of abuse. So in fact, Indian domestic workers like their Filipina counterparts believed that there were good employers out there and that with some luck, they will find those good employers. So that's, it's not really a case where they don't know about the kind of conditions. So you make the point that most employers do not abuse domestic workers, even though some do. Now, I was wondering, could this be specific to the case of Filipina domestic workers who may be able to attract a larger share of the pool of employers who respect human rights of domestic workers than, say, domestic workers from India or Ethiopia? And this is coming from my own reading of narratives where I'm not really able to come to a conclusion like that. So there could be an issue of matching. I'm talking about the Indian narratives that I have generated myself. So there could be an issue of matching employers and workers on the labor market where Filipina domestic workers, because they enjoy a better reputation than migrant workers of other nationalities, may have access to a distinct class of employers. I'm mindful of what you said that, the Western or the foreign employers think they're a class apart, but that's not necessarily so. But even so, the kind of employers that different nationalities of domestic workers have access to could be quite different. The literature also makes it clear that the labor market for domestic workers in the Middle East is stratified in terms of nationalities of workers. Thus, for instance, wage rates are cited according to the nationality of domestic workers, and the minimum wages instituted by source countries differ, and Philippines has really the highest minimum wages. And Filipino domestic workers are actually able to command higher wages as well. I've had spoken to workers who had co-workers from the Philippines, and they said they were paid less despite being made to do, similar kinds of work, or despite being made to do work for as long hours, if not more, etc. And that was because, the Filipino workers came with a package and their recruitment agencies supported them. That was not the case for Indian workers. Now, your work drew my attention to a dimension of the vulnerability of Filipino domestic workers that I was completely unaware of, as I was accustomed to thinking of Filipino domestic workers as generally better placed on the labor market. You point out that there's significant access to foreigners who are part of the higher end employers is a source of vulnerability, as foreign employers could leave the country, creating difficulties for workers under the kafala. By contrast, Indian workers work predominantly for nationals, which allowed them a greater possibility of remaining in continuous employment, as a segment of them did. In contrast to Filipino workers, Indian workers lack virtually any state support for migration, which has been sustained on the strength of formal networks and connections. This has meant that migrant domestic workers are drawn mostly from a few spatial clusters, and their experience of employment is defined to a large extent by the quality of their informal networks. Informality comes with its own risks, especially in the form of poor conditions of employment, and success depends on the ability of domestic workers to manage these risks. You write about Filipina domestic workers being in two categories of employment, as regular sponsored workers and undocumented workers. I'm wondering whether Filipino workers do not migrate in what in South Asia are called the free visas, which a section of Indian domestic workers did obtain. As free visas are purchased from sponsors and the worker is expected to find work on an informal open market, the separation of the sponsor from the employer introduces a distinct dimension, a distinct dynamic, and a dimension of autonomy. The accounts of workers who were on these visas suggest that being free to exit jobs if they found the conditions unacceptable, they were less susceptible to the arbitrary powers of employers. In fact, I remember one woman who told me, how can my employer trouble me when I am on my own visa? So, it was a sense of independence there. Yet they remain dependent on the sponsor, who can report them as absconding workers and have them detained and deported. Hence, they are vulnerable to deportation, but their relative autonomy is qualitatively different from that of undocumented workers, whose vulnerability you describe so vividly. Notably, the Tadbir centers that have been introduced in the UAE also offer scope for this differentiation between the sponsor and the employer, where the government is the sponsor and the worker can find their own employment. And I'm just wondering whether that does not also provide some space for greater independence for workers. My closing comment is on your observation in the conclusion that domestic work is a moralized labor market, and that labor markets are intensely moralized and moralizing entities. And that they explain the emergence of distinct cultures of domestic work across households. I was hoping you could elaborate a little on this, but I was also wondering whether morality comes in where market power or bargaining power through the threat of exit, for instance, diminishes. Thank you. I'll close there.
Great. Thank you so much, Praveena. That was really a fabulous set of comments, and I can't wait to hear Rhacel's response to those comments. So now we move on to Vani.
Thank you. Thank you, Praveena. You've covered most of what I wanted to raise as well. And thank you, Rhacel, for a really interesting book. I think it's so important to bring in, these layers, not just domestic work, but to migration itself, that tends to get lost when reporting is centered around exploitation alone. And you had done this even earlier with your paper on food, which I found very interesting, and this book too. My comments come from the work that my organization and I do. We worked extensively with employers of domestic workers in Qatar and to an extent in Kuwait and Saudi. And we, our main research and experience is from the Gulf and the source countries, the origin countries in South and Southeast Asia, and increasingly from Africa. So I want to bring in the comparison when you're looking at UAE versus the other GCC countries where possible, and also Filipino workers versus workers from other source countries, other origin countries. I found it really interesting that you broke down the chapters, the way you've broken down, looking at the three kinds of households, the different facets of not just kafala, other legislative codes that affect domestic workers, and building on that. And one of the things that that probably I would want to know more about is the book Unfree is about that relationship between two individuals, the employer and employee. But what is the relationship between the employer and the work itself, the domestic work? And what is the relationship, or what are the factors internalized by the worker in terms of the work he or she does, right? Because there is a disconnect. Though we keep saying domestic work, we're trying to mainstream that usage. It is very much seen as helpers. They're not seen as workers. And it's reflected in the fact that they're not included in the labor law. There is a separate law that is just a glorified contract, which takes away the protections they would receive if they were seen as worker and the sector is seen as an integral labor market structure that is there in place of services the government fails to provide. These are the public services, childcare, elderly care. It also, domestic work is also, provides nannies for young adults. That's the thing. And that's the codependency that comes in between a household and the worker. So when you speak about the three types of households, often the same household has all three facets. There might be the parents who are paying the salary, the sponsors who infantilize the workers, but don't probably abuse them. And then you'll have young adults, mainly women, whose mobility is dependent on the domestic worker. For them to go out, they need a guardian. And for the domestic worker to have some level of freedom, meet her friends, she's accompanying these young women. So there is a dependency. And then you have children as well. We've seen in our work that a lot of the abuse does come from children. And not just where you speak about abuse from children in your book. There's the other aspect of young teens, pubescent boys within household who sexually abuse their domestic workers. And those are things that you don't often find reported. Abuse is very often spoken at one level. Either it is physical violence or sexual violence perpetrated by the adults in the family. So it was good to see you mentioning these different players within, but also I do believe that no one household falls under a type. There will be different people within that household who have different relationships with the domestic worker. That brings us to, you do have your critique of how international NGOs cover domestic work and the call for abolishing of kafala. I agree that it's sometimes too flat, it has no nuance, but also to look at why is that the main argument? Because when things go bad, how does the kafala withstand it? We saw it in the last 2 years with COVID. Even the good employers, because this is very much a personal thing, right? You have a savior complex, you want to be a good employer, But if you lose your job, if you have a job cut, if you're under pressure, who's bearing the brunt of it? Up to what extent does your goodness extend when things go bad? And I think kafala, especially in the absence of other supportive legislative framework, really makes domestic workers very, very vulnerable, which is why that is being questioned. And I'm going through the notes that I have from your books. I want to make sure I cover quite a few of that. Coming to Tadbir, which Praveena mentioned and you mentioned as well, even with Tadbir, they do have the live-out models. And we saw during COVID that they were forcing their workers to go into live-in arrangements because they could not manage the live-out arrangement or the part-time work that Tadbir ordinarily offers. So that is what I mean when I say, when things are at its worst, how does the kafala function? How does the employer function? Do we just leave it for the goodness of the individual? And there's another part of your book where you're speaking about, absolute freedom, where the absence of restraint is the only thing. But it's more than that, right? It's not so much the absence of restraint, but dismantling of the various strangleholds that isolate domestic workers. In terms of Filipino workers, they already have a community. They have a sense of community. They have subcultures. They've built relationships even before they arrive at destination. This is not true for all other nationalities. You may find this amongst Ethiopians in Kuwait and in Saudi, but not so much in Qatar. You may not find it for workers who are coming from Uganda. So we need to see, maybe the system works when all of the factors work well. But what if you're coming in, if you're a new migrant, you're coming from a new origin country and you don't have the support network you need, you probably don't even have a diplomatic mission there to help you, then how does a kafala function? I think that is where we need to start questioning and probably explore, the abolishing of kafala. The other thing that I wanted to also speak about is the repeat migration. Why do women keep migrating? Why do migrants keep migrating? And one is lack of knowledge. The other could be in the hope that their story would be different or the next time would be different from from their colleagues or their past experience. We worked with partners and interviewed women from Nepal and Bangladesh, and they are escaping domestic violence and abuse at home as well. And they're very aware that they may face it at origin, but they feel that it's worth taking that risk because they'll at least be paid for it, that they'll have a degree of freedom when they escape very, very conservative, patriarchal households back home. And you see many of them getting into irregularity, unwilling to go back home, preferring to take the risks. Which then brings me back to this thing about absconding, which you mentioned. The book talks about absconding when things are so bad and you want to escape. So as a voluntary act. But oftentimes it's a compulsion because the only way you have access to justice, like you can go file a complaint, is if you leave your employer's home. And the minute you leave your employer's home, you're going to be criminalized for absconding. So they have no choice. So you have that. But you also have people, and we in our research, in our interviews with Ethiopian migrant workers in Ethiopia and in destination, the repeat migrants especially had a plan. They said, we will go on a contract and we will leave. We will run away and we will find our own thing. They come with a plan, aware of the risks they're taking because they have no other option. There is no escape from the live-in model of domestic work across the region. There's a monopoly on it. So they take that risk. It's a calculated risk they take to leave the households and go, live within their community. And that again happens, in probably the Ethiopian community or Filipino community where there are numbers, where there are people to support each other. I'm just gonna stop here. Because everything else has been covered, and looking forward to Rhacel's comments on it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vani, for another very fascinating set of comments. So I'll hand over to Rhacel now.
Okay, and so I don't want to speak too long because maybe some people in the audience have questions. So I'll just first thank you for those really thought-provoking comments that also like points to areas I could have covered more in the book to give the analysis definitely more nuance. And so just looking at these comments, I want to note that in the topology that I formed of these employers who recognize the humanity of domestic workers, and then infantilization, and then those who dehumanize them. So I want to note that when domestic workers are recognized, they're not necessarily recognized as equals to their employers. And so I really emphasize that this is an unequal relationship, and that I really move away from advocating for that this should be an egalitarian relationship, because at the end, the way even those who recognize the humanity of domestic workers, like all of them, do not see their domestic workers as equals. But in the context that they do not, how do we then morally encourage employers to not act on their power? Is like really what I'm trying to get to in the book. And so then a comment I want to emphasize is the issue of the source countries. And yes, absolutely, source countries, as Pravina was saying, really matter, and they really shape the labor conditions of domestic workers at the end. And so one of the discussions I have in the book is that, I say that what accounts for the variety of conditions for domestic workers is really the moral standards that employers carry in their behavior. And so the morals of behavior are shaped by these external forces, and they're not just these like interior sort of self that creates morals. And so there's what I call, like, in going from the work of Howard Becker, these rule creators. And sending states are definitely rule creators, like NGOs are definitely rule creators, and they are the ones who create these discourses then that shape, that give standards to an occupation that otherwise does not have any standards. And so I really saw the difference in sort of how sending states play a role as rule creators here when I was interviewing the representatives from the Bangladeshi consulate, and it was really such a their attitude was such a stark difference to the consul staff of from the Philippines, where you really saw, like, Filipino consulate officials had this sort of national affinity towards those who are most subjugated from their country. But the Bangladeshi officials, really, you could really see clearly that there was really kind of a middle class versus like working class distinction in how they saw themselves as separate and different from people from their country. And so, the standards that they had for domestic workers from Bangladesh was significantly lower. It was like $150 a month was their minimum wage. It was just, there was really no advocacy. They really promoted their domestic workers to be like, to see themselves as subordinates, to not like kind of fight for their rights. And so speaking of rights then, so I really didn't talk about, the rights of domestic workers. And so I do want to note that their membership in society is not definitely one of being equal to their employers, but I'm calling, but as I noted repeatedly in the book, is that their membership in society is one of being a subordinate. But even if they are subordinates, how do we then ensure that they're not abused in their subordinate position? And so, yeah, I definitely did not sort of advocate and say, oh, employers saw them as equals. That was definitely not the case. But even if they are occupying subordinate positions in society, they still have these basic rights then that should be recognized by those that interact with them. And so then, and so I'm glad you brought up Andrew Gardner. I don't really like his argument. I feel his argument is very patronizing towards, people from India sort of being ignorant of what they could potentially face. But he does make that argument in this article of his, so I had to kind of bring that out in the book. So this question, most employers do not abuse, is that a Filipino case? It's like very interesting. Of course, it's very hard to interview employers who will say, oh, I'm an abusive person. Everyone thinks they're a nice person. So oftentimes I found like abuse is something people are not even aware of. I mean, there's people who do extreme abuse. And so these are the people who like beat up their domestic workers. These are the people who like really subjugate their domestic workers. But I found that is it's not necessarily, Filipinos are not necessarily free of abuse. I mean, it definitely happens, I feel like, last thing, the Tadbir Center, I know Prabha has her hand up, but the last center, what's really interesting, right, is the Tadbir Center now basically is giving 4 visa options for domestic workers. One of the options is like for them to be this kind of free visa holder where they can, have multiple employers, right? But what's interesting is that the Philippine state, speaking of the state, has denied Filipino domestic workers access to these other kinds of visas, and that they're still only limiting the kinds of visas the domestic workers can have to the one that's like a one-on-one live-in employment. And so for the Philippine government, they're doing that because they think, interestingly enough, that the Filipinos will have kind of the most power and ability to negotiate for better working conditions through this like one-on-one relationship that they have with employers. And so that's kind of fascinating as well. So let me end there to open up for questions.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Rhacel. So I think the first person we have in line is Shalini Grover. Shalini, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for the absolutely most fascinating afternoon. Thank you, Prabha. Thank you, Rhacel. Thank you, Vani. Thank you, Praveena. It's been wonderful. I actually have 3 comments, if I may. I really want to congratulate you, Rhacel, for bringing in a certain nuance here when it comes to your offering a more diverse range of experiences. For example, I have a study here that I've just referred to by Wahabi and Poying 2017, which says that migrant care workers who arrived from Saudi Arabia to Canada with excellent health experience a progressive decline in their mental health in Canada and are much better off in Saudi Arabia because they're given more respect for their qualifications and their credentials, and they fared worse in Canada. So in a sense, I think, the Middle East is so associated with slavery and bad working conditions that I think international comparisons are a great way to somehow balance some of this diversity that you see, and their focus on mental health was really the way forward in coming up with this finding. The second thing is I'm also very much in line with you with regard to, I've worked a huge amount on expatriates in India and Delhi, and I've also dispelled and shattered this good employer image that they keep is very powerful in a local context because they give a holiday. They give 1 holiday a week, which tends to be their main kind of championing that they're good employers. But I've also shown that there are many different models in place for really what works for domestic workers at the end of the day. And the third comment is something for everyone, and especially related to your book, is that we're so focused on employer-employer vexed relationships that are so vexed from times immemorial that are we, as an anthropologist, because I'm an anthropologist, are we ever going to shift the focus of life beyond servitude and what goes on, in other phases and aspects of life, kinship, mother-daughter bonds, all those other things that goes on beyond servitude. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Rhacel. Can't hear you.
I was gonna say, oh, can you give me the citation of the article? That's like really
Yes, I'll just put it on the chat.
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, I was just, I mean, I definitely didn't want to be, like I've been accused of being an apologist for the Philippine state because they wanted scholars sort of expect me to write this thing like Philippine state bad, they're like sending their workers out to be raped. So no one really accused me of being bad for showing there's nuance in experiences of domestic workers. But I thought what was really interesting was that the most what I was really kind of accused of was like, not being more critical of the Philippine state in my analysis. But I do know that I push against the argument of other domestic worker scholars, and they haven't really said anything to me either. But I'm glad that you were receptive to my more nuanced findings, to be honest. But so thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Teres? Maybe you can also introduce yourself. I should have.
Okay. Yes. I don't know if I'm an anthropologist, and I've been working on. I'm based in Bangladesh. I've been working also in Oman, in Oman, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. Presently, we are working at Source, and I want to reinforce what was said by Pravina, that the Filipino women paid higher salaries, having better job, better condition. That's regularly on the line. The Bangladeshi women are at the bottom in terms of pay, and when you talk about your visit to the labor attaché or the ambassador in the UAE from Bangladesh, and you notice that they regarded themselves as middle class and the domestic worker. This is a huge problem. So the women here have to face not only the difficulties abroad, but the very bad name that they get here. I know it's in other countries as well, but I mean, the media coverage of migrant worker is just toxic. It's terrible. So the women say we just close our ears and don't listen to these things because otherwise we would never migrate. And the women who migrate, I mean, one does not understand this migration if one does not understand their life history, their life path, where they come from, and why it is beneficial. For the majority of the women, they say, I would go again. It's better. My life is better. What I earn, what I can negotiate with my family afterwards, it's better. So the title of your book shocked me a little. It's very unfree. I mean, it's I mean, you think of slavery and so on, which I'm trying to fight this kind of association. I back what others have said about I mean, the number of women, and that's easier. It was easier in Lebanon. Lebanon now, the conditions are not good, but in Lebanon and in Jordan, women running away. Running away, just leaving their employer. And sometimes it's not a legal procedure, but sometimes having an arrangement with a kafil who say, okay, you do some work for me, but you are free to work in other households as well. And these women are real entrepreneurs. I call them entrepreneurs, and they earn more. And often this is not done at the first migration because they have to know the language, the geography, and so on. And some women are doing really extremely well. I also wrote a little bit on these women living arrangement with Habibi, and I mean it concerns the Filipino women as well. This freedom to move away from the employer is much more difficult in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia for Bangladeshi women is the main destination now, and there they are really much more dependent on the kafil because there is no possibility to move freely on the street. So the title of your book is, it certainly attracts attention, but I'm a bit unhappy about it because I'm trying to emphasize here how women are in a system that's not always favorable to them, but they are really, some are caught, cannot get out, but quite a number of them are able to, if they don't have a good employer, many do not stay there, and then they work with this free visa, and so it's a, as you say, it's a very complex, varied image, and so, as I say, since I'm trying to fight so hard here, the media, the government, to say these women are not, I mean, they are being, the demeaning consideration it's not only, some women found their employers abroad giving them more importance than what they have in the home of their in-laws. So it's a very complex picture. Thank you. I haven't read your book, but I discovered your name today.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that comment. I mean, I should just say that, when I was writing this book and when I was doing field work, it was really hard not to kind of feel like kind of disgusted, like, because the stories, the brutal stories that I read, that I heard in person were really horrific, but I didn't want this to be like an oppression porn book too, right? Like that. I was like, oh, here, which I think, these like free the slaves people would like want me to do, because then it's like the horrific experiences were overwhelming me. I had to also like step back and say, but these like the one really jarring experience is not the majority of stories I'm hearing, right? So I do want to emphasize that it's, so when while I'm calling diversity in experiences, I also want to emphasize that I heard some pretty horrific stories that I'd never heard of in the US context, for example. And so there is something about the system there that enables sort of this extreme abuse. That's one point I want to make. And something about the free visa too. Interestingly, Filipinos are not necessarily going to have a free visa because I think it's inaccessible to them. I think it's more accessible for Indians and Bangladeshi because of the proximity of the countries. So it's more affordable for them to go there versus the Filipinos who go there. I mean, they have like zero resources. They're like the poorest of the poor, which is something we don't hear about from the literature. And so they're quite, impoverished. And so having their own visa, paying, the 8,000 to 15,000 dirhams they need, they don't have that. And so it's not something domestic workers from the Philippines will have. And if they do have that, they will be more likely a professional or a semi-professional doing this work. And so last comment about this word unfree. So I use unfree because I push against, as I talk about in the appendix, there are politically charged words, phrases that we use when we write about people who are under the kafala system. And that would be slavery, forced labor, or human trafficking. And those three terms are really politically charged terms with a one-size-fits-all solution. And so I actually chose to call the people I'm studying unfree to really foreground their unequal relationship with their sponsor and to really call attention to the fact that this really shapes their experiences. But at the same time, I did not want my analysis to be already politically stained or, politically kind of attached to this like one size fits all solution that we already have for that many people have when they write or think about their experiences. And so I try to define then what I mean by unfree. And for me, to be unfree, again, is not necessarily to be in a position of being unable to act, but really it's being in a position in which you are subject to the arbitrary authority of another person. And so how do you then try to diminish the person with arbitrary authority to act on their power?
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Rhacel. So we have a comment from Igor. Maybe he can just voice it out. Igor, are you there?
Yeah, hello. I hope you can hear me. I'm in Lebanon and sometimes the the power is not very good. So, but yeah, the question was, I think Pravina touched a little bit on it. It's that employers are of different types, and there's there's a wide spectrum of those who need some type of paid work just for temporary or part-time situation, rather than having a worker full-time. There could be also like small families that cannot afford because they're just working, or it could be financial issues. There's a variety of different, and sometimes it can be migrants themselves, other expatriate families who are from like middle income and who cannot afford to have some. And so often when we talk about domestic work, we tend to focus on this sort of stereotype of the sort of elite domestic work relationship of an employer, and not this other spectrum of employers that does exist. And therefore, we tend to sort of insist that for instance, from the ILO, that what needs to be done applies to these to those categories of employers, and not to this other sort of spectrum of employers where there's many issues that happen as well. And so basically, I wanted to, if you have any reflections about that, and yeah, that was it. It's great. And by the way, thank you very much. It sounds very interesting. Looking forward to read your book.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question about, variety of employers. And so the vast majority of, this is before the TABIA, right? But the vast majority of employers who, do employ domestic workers, because of the affordability of it, they will just hire a living domestic worker. And so what you'll find is that the people who do hire someone like to just clean their home, they're usually like doing it through an agency. And so the agency gets the bulk of the money. And so for some employers, there's like a moral dilemma that happens where they know that they're paying the agency a lot, but they like are trying to imagine how much the domestic worker is making. So domestic workers who do like work for an agency and then they clean multiple households, they will make like the same amount as a live-in worker, except the live-in workers. So when I'm talking about Filipinos here, they should be making $1,500 minimum wage. Even agency employed domestic workers are not making that the Philippine government recommended minimum wage, though they will probably make like 1,200 dirhams, versus those who are a live-in employee have the risk of only making 800 dirhams. And so then, so what's interesting is then, what I found was that employers who do choose not to have someone in their house, it's usually because they're single, or there's just a couple with older children, or with no children at all. But definitely if they have a pet dog, they will get a live-in domestic worker. So when they go away for the summers, the domestic worker could stay with their dog. But what was interesting was that the amount of money that many of because they would have like someone come into their house twice a week for 8 hours a week or 6 hours a week. In those cases, they pay as much as like a live-in would, of course, minus the food. And then what I also found, however, that, what I talk about can also apply to those employers who have like, that come in, like domestics that come once a week or twice a week. It was really interesting. Some of them, like their domestic workers work from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And you ask them, what are they eating? And then they're like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know if they're eating, right? So you have these like clueless employers who basically like, have someone working in their house 6 hours and they're not even thinking if this person is going to eat or not, right? And so you could see that that's kind of an inhumane working condition, versus you'll have employers who are like, they work in my house from like 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And so I always say, you have to eat, you have to eat, you have to eat. But then they're like afraid of me. They won't eat. So like, I'm just worried that the agency is not feeding them adequately. And so you do still have this variety of employers who then, when they have a live out situation.
Great, thank you. Parvati?
Hi. Thanks ever so much for a fantastic set of discussions. And I actually wanted to really sort of think about two things that this made me think of. Is one of them is the degrees of freedom and unfreedom that you're talking about, and and particularly what that speaks to us about the conditions of the productions of those unfreedom, of the different degrees of unfreedom. And the other thing that I think really came across really wonderfully to me across the India examples from the discussants and your own book is this whole thing about class and one of them as class as played out across and racialized gender class differences as it's played out between employee relations, and this global class stratification almost which is happening between Bangladeshis at the bottom, Indians at the top. So arising from both of those things, there's one thing that very specifically that I wanted to ask you is that did the Filipinas domestic workers speak about their relations with, or what they thought of Bangladeshis or Indian domestic workers, or particularly in the context of a politics of class reproduction and class changing class relations, what forms of transversal political options are made available through these kinds of working across different relationships of class?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because you point to like a finding I had that I felt analytically inadequate to analyze. So there were actually two of them. One is like the use of Facebook. And so domestic workers really used, like, especially those without a day off, it was like Facebook was their kind of way that they could create a community of support. Many would say, oh, my best friend that I've never met in person, but like I only met in Facebook. So I think Facebook has these algorithms. If they're from the same area, they end up in the same area. They're like, do you know this person? And then they'll like kind of befriend each other. And then there were all these domestic worker support groups on Facebook. And it would include those who were not allowed access to the internet, but the teenage kid would give them the password secretly behind the back of their parents, And so then, so there is this, like, as was commented earlier, variances in employers, but it's also not necessarily variances of oppression, but you definitely have allies emerging in the household to defy the most oppressive of employers. And so that's something I found. But when it came also, another finding that I had that I couldn't really, I didn't feel adequate in analyzing it, and so I didn't really analyze it, was this, what was interesting, it was like a pan-Asian solidarity emerged among domestic workers. And there was definitely a distinction that they were making between themselves and African, particularly Ethiopian domestic workers. And so the solidarity and differences emerged within household and outside the household. So like if you were gonna go to parks, you would, on a Thursday, an afternoon, a random afternoon, there would be like, you would come up to people because they were clearly domestic workers, and then you would think they were all Filipino. Then you would be shocked that it would be like, not all of them are Filipino. They're like, oh, this is the Nepalese who doesn't speak, because she doesn't speak our language. She doesn't speak anything, but she would otherwise just be sitting on her own. So we don't want to leave her alone. So we're including her in our group, right? And then you also had these, like, a lot of times they would post on Facebook. They would post a picture of like a South Asian domestic worker and they would start describing their work conditions. This is my employer's cousin's domestic worker. Look at her eyes. She doesn't say, and so they're just like really becoming conscious of cross-country variations in their labor conditions. Definitely, you see a lot of empathy towards other Asians that are merging there. But what was really interesting was that definitely there was this, like, do you call it anti-Blackness, right? But what was very interesting is that a lot of the Emirati employers are themselves Blacks, right? And so they would say then that it was like they don't like this Ethiopian because they would always align with the employers. So they definitely saw, like, they never talked about Kenyans, but it was like the Ethiopians. They were talking about Ethiopians as, more aligned with employers than with them. Is this anti-Blackness? I don't know. Is this like a Muslim versus non-Muslim division? I don't know. But definitely, there was like a pan-Asian alliance. that I saw among particularly like with Filipinos, feeling an affinity with Indians, Bangladeshi, Nepalis, and Indonesians. But I don't write about that. I felt like it was like, oh, I wish I could have written about it, but it was really kind of something I didn't feel equipped to analyze.
That's your next paper.
Yeah.
Look forward to that. Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Thanks. While maybe others come up with questions, I had a question for you, Rhacel. I think your book is actually a fantastic, it's a fantastic piece of literature to share with law students, to teach to law students, because I think what you show really well is what we lawyers call legal pluralism, which is, layers of laws, different kinds of laws and sets of norms, social norms that, that kind of interrelate with each other to produce very different kinds of outcomes. And I think you set it out very nicely. And I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, in terms of, you talk about the law of the household as being a site where, relationships are kind of fashioned between the employer and employee. And I just wondered whether, this law of the household could be transposed to other sectors, because I think there is a place where you talk about sex work. I think you quote Pardesh Madhui's work on how, domestic workers who are not getting paid enough go on to do sex work. And I just wondered whether this idea of the law of the household is something that you've also worked on entertainers, obviously, in the past, in your past work. And I just wondered whether this idea of the workplace as a site of building norms was unique to just domestic work, or whether you see it in other arenas of women's work. And it's just a fascinating piece of legal ethnography that I thought was very instructive.
No, yeah, thank you for your comment. So the law of the household, I built from the work of Adele Blackett, and how she, as a legal theorist, she talks about how within domestic work there's these laws of the household, and so I am definitely just sort of building from her observations and saying, yes, that's how we can have a variety of norms that emerge across different households, right? So it's not necessarily like, it's so hard because it's multiple workplaces and not just like one unitary workplace. But definitely, I also found this to be the case among hostesses in Japan. I don't obviously call it law of the households in that context, but I talk about it as cultural regimes of the workplace, right? And how these cultures of like cultural norms of the workplace emerge from the interaction between employers and of the customers and the hostesses. And so it's not just imposed by the management, but it's also like created by the everyday interactions. The everyday interactions and what is tolerated by those around them will create a particular cultural regime of like sex work. And so likewise, I found like varieties in sort of labor norms where there are some, hostess bars that were like more tolerant of explicit sexual gestures, while, you go to some bars and it's like very tame, like they're not touching each other at all. And those are basically bars where the customers were like 90 years old, 80 years old, and they're really just lonely and want to be entertained. And they really have no energy for anything more than that. But then you have much more like others that are more sexually explicit ones, and then ones that are like in between, where you see some doing it and some like not doing it. So, but yes, definitely to your question. Yes.
Thank you. Are there any other final thoughts or questions for Rhacel? Okay. So I think I just want to thank you very, very, very much for an absolutely fascinating book, which I completely thoroughly enjoyed and would recommend to everyone. And thanks for taking the time for doing this incredible work, which I think is really provocative at many levels. And and I also want to thank Praveena and Vani for their excellent comments. I think they really drove home the point of how a comparative analysis can be so illuminating. And so Thanks to all of you for making this conversation happen. Thanks, Rhacel. And we look forward to more of your work. Congratulations.
Thank you. See you. Bye.